The sun was slowly setting behind the red mountains, painting the sky with warm colors of orange and gold. The wind carried the smell of dust and grass across the open land. Ethan Rowe, a quiet rancher, rode his old brown horse along the river trail. He had been living alone for many years, far from town, far from noise, and far from people. His small wooden cabin stood at the edge of the valley, surrounded by miles of dry plains and rocky hills. That lonely place was his home. He had no wife, no family, and no one to talk to except his horse and the sound of the wind. Ethan was a kind man, but one who had learned to keep his feelings to himself. He worked hard every day, mending fences, feeding his cattle, and watching the weather. Life on the frontier was simple but not easy. Yet he liked the peace it gave him. He didn't go to town much because he didn't like trouble. He had once worked with soldiers and traders, but after losing too many friends to the roughness of the land, he chose silence over company. That evening, as he rode home with the sun on his back, he heard something faint. At first it sounded like the cry of an animal, maybe a coyote or a bird. But after a moment it came again, and this time it was different. It was a voice, a cry for help. Ethan stopped his horse and listened carefully. The sound came from the river ahead. His heart started to beat faster. Without wasting time, he kicked his horse gently and rode toward the sound. When he reached the river bend, he saw something that froze him in place. A girl was in the water, struggling against the current. She was being pulled under again and again, trying to reach the shore but failing. Her long dark hair floated around her like a shadow. Ethan jumped off his horse without thinking twice and ran toward the bank. The river wasn't very deep, but the current was strong. The girl was getting weaker every second. Ethan waded into the cold water, feeling the pull of the current against his legs. The rocks under his feet were slippery and the water reached up to his chest. He fought his way forward, his eyes locked on the girl who was now just a few feet away. She went under again, and for a second he feared he was too late. But then his hand caught her arm. He pulled her toward him with all his strength, keeping her head above the water as he slowly moved back to the shore. When they finally reached land, Ethan laid her gently on the grass. She wasn't moving. He quickly turned her on her side and pressed on her back until she coughed out water. Her chest began to rise and fall again. After a few moments, her eyes opened wide, full of confusion and fear. She looked around, breathing fast, trying to understand what had happened. Ethan spoke softly, telling her she was safe now. But she didn't understand his words. The girl spoke something in Apache, her voice weak and trembling. Ethan knew only a few words of their language, not enough to answer her. He noticed her clothes were wet and torn from the rocks. Her hands were shaking and her lips were pale from the cold. Without saying much, Ethan took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. She looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes but didn't resist. He helped her to his horse, lifting her carefully so she could sit. She was light, almost too weak to hold herself steady. Ethan climbed behind her and began the slow ride back to his cabin. The sky had grown darker and the air was turning cold. The girl shivered from the wind, but Ethan held the reins steady and rode as fast as the horse could manage on the rocky trail. By the time they reached the cabin, the moon was out, shining softly over the valley. Ethan lifted the girl down and carried her inside. The cabin was small but warm, with a fire burning in the old stone fireplace. He set her near the fire and took out a blanket to wrap around her. She watched him carefully, still unsure if she should trust him. Ethan spoke gently, trying to calm her. He boiled water and made a small pot of beans and bread, then placed a plate near her. She didn't eat much at first, but slowly, she began to take small bites. Hours passed before she spoke again. Her English was broken, but Ethan could understand enough. She said her name was Ayana. She had tried to cross the river with her younger brother earlier that day. The river had been calm at first, but halfway through, she slipped on a rock and the current carried her away. Her brother managed to reach the other side, but she had been swept downstream. She thought she would never see her family again. Ethan listened quietly, nodding as she spoke. He told her she could stay until morning, and then he would help her find her family. The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she wiped them quickly and nodded. She sat close to the fire, her hands stretched toward the warmth, her face soft and tired. Ethan noticed how young she looked, maybe 14 or 15, yet her eyes held a kind of strength he couldn't explain. The night grew still. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, but inside, the fire crackled softly. Ethan leaned back in his chair, feeling the ache in his arms from fighting the river. He looked at the girl sleeping by the fire, wrapped in his old blanket, and thought about how strange life could be. A few hours ago, he had been just a lonely rancher on his way home. Now, there was someone in his cabin, a girl he didn't know but had risked his life to save. In the early hours of the morning, the light of dawn crept through the window. Ayanna woke up slowly and looked around. For a moment she seemed frightened, but then she saw Ethan by the door feeding his horse. She stood up and walked outside. The air was cool and clean, and mist hung over the river in the distance. She looked at him and whispered a quiet thank you in English. Ethan smiled faintly and nodded. He told her he would help her find her tribe. She seemed unsure at first, as if afraid of what might happen, but finally agreed. Together, they packed some food and water for the journey. Ethan saddled his horse and made sure Ayanna was wrapped warmly. Before they left, she walked toward the river and stood there for a long time, staring at the water that had almost taken her life. The reflection of the rising sun danced across her face. Ethan watched from a distance, wondering what thoughts filled her heart. When she turned back, her eyes looked stronger, no longer afraid. As they rode toward the hills, the land stretched wide and silent around them. The sky was a bright, endless blue. Ethan didn't know what kind of danger he might face going into Apache territory, but something inside him told him it was the right thing to do. By afternoon, they stopped near a rocky hill for rest. Ayanna pointed toward the horizon and said her family's camp was beyond the distant ridge. Ethan nodded, though he knew that crossing into their land could be risky. But he didn't tell her that. Instead, he smiled gently and told her they'd reach there by the next day. As night fell again, they camped under the stars. Ayanna sat by the small fire he built, quiet and thoughtful. Ethan noticed she was calmer now, her fear replaced by hope. She told him that if her father knew he saved her, he would thank him deeply. Ethan only smiled, saying he didn't need thanks. He had done what any man should do. The night air grew colder and the sound of the river echoed in the distance. Ethan looked at the fire, then at the stars above. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but deep down he felt something had changed. The lonely rancher who once avoided people now found a reason to ride beside one. He didn't yet know that by the next evening, riders would appear on the horizon. Riders who would stop in front of his cabin carrying more than just gratitude. The morning sun rose gently over the hills, painting the valley in shades of soft gold. Ethan Rowe stood near his cabin, splitting wood with his axe as the cool air brushed his face. The sound of the river nearby was calm and peaceful now, so different from the wild noise it had made the day before. Ayanna was sitting near the fire inside eating bread and beans. She looked stronger, her face calm but thoughtful. It had been a strange 2 days for both of them. Ethan had saved her life without thinking twice, but now, as he looked toward the horizon, he knew the next step would not be as simple. He had promised to help her find her people, and that meant crossing into Apache territory, a place where few ranchers went willingly. Still, a promise was a promise. Ethan was not the kind of man who walked away after giving his word. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked up. The quiet morning was suddenly broken by the sound of distant hooves. At first he thought it was a small herd of wild horses, but then he noticed the rhythm. These were riders, many of them moving fast. He put down the axe and walked toward the edge of the yard. Dust began to rise over the dry path leading from the east. Ayanna stepped outside, her eyes narrowing as she listened. Then her expression changed. Her lips parted and she whispered something in Apache that Ethan couldn't understand. She ran forward a few steps, her blanket falling from her shoulders. Ethan followed her with his eyes, realizing that whoever was coming wasn't a threat to her. They were her people. The riders came closer, their horses slowing as they approached the cabin. There were about 6 of them, each dressed in traditional Apache clothing. Their long hair flowed behind them, and the sunlight glinted off the silver decorations on their belts. The one in front was taller than the rest, his posture straight and his face strong. He wore a necklace made of carved bone and turquoise stones, and his eyes carried both authority and calm. Ayanna ran toward him, calling out in her native language. The tall man leapt from his horse before she reached him, and they met halfway, holding each other tightly. Ethan stood still, feeling a quiet sense of relief wash over him. It was clear now that this man was her father. The other riders watched in silence as the man looked down at his daughter, touching her face as if to make sure she was truly alive. Then his gaze shifted toward Ethan. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other. The air was still, and even the horses seemed to quiet down. Ethan could not read the expression in the man's eyes. It wasn't anger, but it wasn't simple gratitude either. It was something deeper, a silent measure of respect perhaps. Ayanna began speaking rapidly in Apache, explaining what had happened. She pointed to the river, then to Ethan, her hands moving as she described the rescue. The tall man listened carefully, nodding once or twice. When she finished, he turned back toward Ethan and took a few steps forward. Ethan stayed where he was, his hat in his hand. He didn't reach for his rifle or make any sudden movement. The man spoke a few words, his tone calm but firm. Ethan didn't understand, but Ayanna translated quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "He says you saved his daughter from the river," she said. "He says you are a brave man and a man of honor." Ethan nodded slightly. "Tell him I just did what anyone would do." Ayanna translated his words, and her father looked at him again, still quiet. Then the man raised his hand and made a gesture, and two of the other riders stepped forward carrying a small bundle wrapped in deer hide. They placed it gently on the ground in front of Ethan. Ayanna looked at her father with surprise, then turned to Ethan. "He says this is for you. A gift, a reward for saving me." Ethan looked down at the bundle. Slowly he knelt and opened it. Inside were several silver ornaments, a few old coins, and a knife with a handle carved from white bone. It was a beautiful piece, polished and clearly made with care. Ethan's hands hesitated. He looked up and shook his head. "Tell him I can't take this," he said softly. "I didn't save her for a reward." Ayanna repeated his words, and her father listened silently. Then the Apache chief stepped forward and placed his hand gently over Ethan's heart, then over his own. It was a simple gesture, but it said everything words could not. Ethan understood. The gift was not about money, it was about respect and gratitude. Ethan accepted the knife, bowing his head slightly. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet. The chief nodded once, his expression calm. Then he turned back to his horse. Before he mounted, Ayanna looked at Ethan with tears in her eyes. "My father says he will not forget you," she said softly. "He says if you ever need help, you will find it." Ethan smiled faintly. "Tell him I'm just glad you're safe." She nodded, her lips trembling slightly. Then she stepped forward and took Ethan's hand for a brief moment, her small fingers warm against his rough, calloused skin. "Thank you," she whispered. Then she turned and climbed onto her horse. Ethan watched as the group rode away across the open land, their horses moving gracefully through the tall grass. The morning sun followed them, and their shadows stretched long across the earth. Within minutes, they disappeared beyond the ridge, leaving only a faint trail of dust behind. Ethan stood there for a long time, the knife still in his hand. He turned it over slowly, admiring the careful carving on the handle. It wasn't gold or silver that made it valuable. It was what it represented. It was a sign of trust, something rare in the Wild West. He felt a quiet sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Days passed, and life on the ranch returned to its slow rhythm. Ethan fed his cattle, mended fences, and rode along the same river trail each evening. Yet something inside him had changed. Whenever he passed the bend where he had pulled Ayanna from the water, he would stop for a moment. The memory always came back clearly, the rush of the water, the weight of her in his arms, the fear and hope mixed together. He realized that small moments like that could change a man's life forever. One morning, about 2 weeks later, Ethan found something strange near his fence. An arrow had been placed carefully in the ground beside one of the posts. It wasn't broken or used, it looked freshly made. The feather on it was tied with a small strip of blue cloth. Ethan picked it up and looked around. There were no riders, no tracks, only the open fields. But he understood the meaning without needing words. The Apache chief hadn't forgotten his promise. The arrow was a sign, a quiet way of saying, "You are watched over. You are a friend." From that day on, no one ever bothered Ethan's land. Traders who passed through said even the wild riders of the desert avoided his ranch. They called him the man protected by the river people. Ethan didn't correct them. He didn't talk much at all about what had happened. He just kept the arrow on his wall beside the carved knife, where the light from the fire touched it every night. Years later, travelers sometimes came through that valley and stayed a night at his cabin. They'd ask if the stories were true, if he had really saved an Apache girl and earned the friendship of her people. Ethan would smile softly and say, "The river brought someone to my door one night, and she brought something back I didn't even know I'd lost." When asked what that was, he would just look out toward the sunset and say, "Peace." The wind would blow through the grass, and the river would whisper softly nearby. Somewhere far beyond the hills, maybe an Apache family still remembered the rancher who had once saved their daughter. But for Ethan, that was enough. He didn't need fame or gold or stories told in towns. All he needed was the quiet sound of the river that had changed his life forever. And though the years would pass and his hair would turn gray, he never forgot the small girl with the dark eyes who had taught him that kindness travels farther than fear. And that sometimes, one simple act by the river can bridge two worlds that had never trusted each other before.